I have measured risk in small sounds for most of my working life. Lead doors closing with a soft seal, the hush of filtered air, the quiet click a dosimeter makes when the world is not as quiet as it should be. On a gray morning in late winter, the first signal arrived not on a screen, but at the back of my tongue. A dry coin taste I had learned to notice only after years in rooms that turn invisible energy into pictures. Our list began with the usual, stone protocols, chest pains that turned out to be muscle, follow-ups that confirmed what we already knew. I signed into the console. The dashboard showed safe baselines. The room monitor glowed a calm green. My badge readout from the prior week sat at routine, well within threshold. The day was set to be ordinary. I met the patient in the holding bay as I had met thousands before. Mid-40s, calm, a little tired around the eyes. The chart flagged intermittent flank pain, no metal implants, no recent procedures by the patient's account. The referral asked for a non-contrast CT, standard low dose, supine position, no sedation. Nothing about the intake prepared me for what would follow. When the nurse rolled the gurney toward the scanner room, my pocket dosimeter ticked once, sharply, and then went quiet. I put a thumb over the face of it out of habit, as if it could be muffled. Inside the control room, I watched the patient shift onto the table. The room monitor that usually idled at a steady line lifted by a small step. Not a spike, not yet, just a nudge above background. I checked the air handling panel, stable. I checked the console for any alerts, all clear. I asked the technologist to pause while I retrieved a handheld meter from the cabinet. The coin taste rose and then faded as quickly. I felt foolish for noticing it. We began the scout view. The shape of a torso, the arcs of ribs, the basin of the pelvis. The lines were crisp. Then, as the table advanced and the tube started its slow rotation, a spray of bright speckles traced across the field in a loose halo around the abdomen, and the room monitor ticked a shallow rise. On the console, the artifact looked like scattered metal, but there was no surgical history and no jewelry. I have seen necklaces forgotten under gowns, metal clasps, even the rare swallowed coin. This was not that. The pattern moved with the tissue, not above it, and it pulsed faintly with each breath. We stopped the series and reset. The technologist checked the table. The patient said he felt fine, no heat, no tingling, nothing unusual reported by the nurse. I recorded the time in the control log, just after 9. Room background at twice baseline during scan start. Return to baseline within a count of 10 breaths after stop. I switched the handheld meter on and set it next to the console screen. A few soft ticks, ordinary. The coin taste settled, then returned when the patient raised his arms for positioning. I lifted the meter and walked to the window, holding it close to the glass. The count increased modestly when aligned with the patient's abdomen, then fell when I lowered it to the level of the thighs. It was not a dramatic change, but it was real enough to note. We finished the scout and captured a series for the kidneys. The images came through the sharp, devoid of motion blur, but the same starry scatter returned. I flagged the study as limited by artifact and opened the patient's chart for anything we might have missed. No recent tracer tests listed, no radiotherapy, no work exposure noted. The intake had asked about industrial sources. The patient had marked no. I added a line to my notes. Consider unreported dental or orthopedic metal. Consider swallowed capsule. Consider signal path issue. The first counter-hypothesis was contamination. The simplest story wins until it does not. A prior visit with a radio tracer could leave a trace, especially if the body clears it slowly. We collected a wipe from the patient's gown, a wipe from the table, and a wipe from the waiting chair he had used. I labeled each with location, time, and initials. The technologist brought up the handheld meter to the gown wipe. Nothing beyond background. The table wipe read a touch higher, then settled, as if whatever we might be chasing did not like to be captured on cotton. The second counter-hypothesis was equipment: a loose shield, a grounding issue, a sensor temperamental in dry winter air. I asked the technologist to switch to the backup meter and to run the room monitor through its quick check routine. All lights passed. The ceiling sensors reported the same steady line they always did when the room was empty. We asked the patient to step off the table and wait behind the protective screen on the far wall. The room returned to baseline. When the patient returned to the table, the line rose by a small step again. The third counter-hypothesis was hidden source. There are seeds placed in certain treatments that can slip from memory, keys that look like jewelry on imaging, small items in pockets that escape attention. We emptied the pockets again and found a bus ticket stub, a coin, and a folded list from a chemist. None explained a spray of bright speckles that shifted with tissue and breath. We moved the coin to a lead dish. No change. We completed the study with gentle adjustments. I kept my face neutral and my notes exact. The coin taste returned whenever the handheld meter ticked more than usual. The technologist said the patient rested well and felt no heat. I recorded the times. Start at a little after 9, pauses at intervals of a few minutes, completion before mid-morning. Baseline rise of roughly twice background with the patient in the room. Peaks of roughly 3 to 4 times background during certain breath holds. Normal background when the patient stepped out and the room rested. The images themselves showed kidneys without stones large enough to cause the worst kind of obstruction. The spray of speckles persisted, strongest in the soft tissues of the abdomen and chest, fading toward the limbs. I flagged the study as requiring correlation and advised, in the report language we keep simple for colleagues, that environmental or physiologic sources be considered. Then I called radiation safety through the internal channel and filed a preliminary note. In our hospital, that step can shut rooms down, so it is not done lightly. I described the readings without drama. I relayed that the patient reported no prior tracer tests, no surgeries, no exposures by work, and no unusual symptoms. Safety sent a physicist to the suite before noon. I briefed him in the control room. He ran his own meter along the seams and corners and beneath the console. He prefers to trust the corners because dust collects what air leaves behind. Baseline. He placed the meter on the sill of the control room window and asked the technologist to cycle the table without a patient. No rise. He stood near the door when the patient returned from the restroom and the meter ticked faster in his hand. He said only that the reading was modest but real. I wrote that sentence in my log because it mattered later. We moved the patient to a small annex room used for portable studies and repeated an abbreviated series without contrast. The annex had different air handling, a separate power feed, and a recently serviced wall monitor. I watched the line. It rose again by the same small step as the patient entered. The handheld meter ticked a little faster when I lifted it toward the patient's chest level and a little slower toward the knees. The images showed the same speckled scatter, aligned with soft tissue, pulsing faintly with breath. My note to self grew sharper in tone. If the phenomenon traveled with the patient across rooms, either the patient carried a source on the surface that our wipes failed to capture, or the body itself emitted something our models do not expect. Between those, the first story was kinder, the second more threatening to how we understand our work. I added more counter-hypotheses to resist premature conclusions. A shop floor exposure unreported because the patient did not realize the relevance. A friend's hobby with old watches and paints. A miscalibrated meter with a coincidental drift. radon pockets in old buildings that happened to align with rooms the patient visited. None fit all the facts, but each explained a part. Stakes sharpened with every tick. If we had a person walking through our corridors triggering rises, we needed to know the cause. If it was the room, closing a scanner for a day can mean delayed scans for many others. If it was the patient's biology, I had no frame to place it in without reaching for words our policy avoids. I wrote a plan that balanced curiosity with duty. We would repeat meter checks with a second brand. We would summon a whole-body counter in a shielded alcove used by nuclear medicine colleagues and run a survey without any tracer present. We would draw basic labs, including thyroid and kidney, simple panels that sometimes hint at how the body clears what the body should not keep. We would ask about home environment again, with attention to basements, clocks, and tools. We would, above all, keep the patient informed in plain terms and avoid speculation. The patient said he felt well. The nurse wrote that he denied any tingling, warmth, or taste changes. I did not write that I tasted metal. I wrote instead that my dosimeter ticked and my meter rose by small margins in the patient's proximity. The distinction matters in reports. The technologist wiped the table again. Later, safety would scan the wipes in a higher sensitivity counter. We labeled everything with times. Late morning entries tend to blur if you do not anchor them. I anchored each. I closed the first report with clear language for the referring clinician. No large obstructive stone seen. Recommend ultrasound if pain persists. Imaging limited by non-metallic scatter artifact. Environmental correlation advised. Then I wrote a separate memo for safety and copied the chief. In that memo I used different words. I described a patient-associated rise in room monitors across 2 rooms, steady and reproducible, with the handheld meter confirmation and image scatter that tracked soft tissue and breath. I asked for guidance on whether to hold the suite or to continue with enhanced checks. The chief wrote back that we would continue with caution and await the physicist's fuller note. The physicist remained calm, as he does when engines misbehave. Calm is contagious in our work. Late in the day, when I stepped out of the suite and into the main corridor, I passed a window that looked over the staff car park. Snow flurries swirled in a narrow wind. A tram bell rang on the street beyond and echoed faintly through the glass. The coin taste vanished as if a switch had flipped. I stood in that quiet and took a breath that did not taste like metal. My badge did not click. I turned back and the dosimeter ticked twice as I approached the doors. The simplest stories held on for now. Contamination remained a contender. The wipes could surprise us when measured by a better instrument. A hidden source could reveal itself when the patient emptied a pocket at home. A meter we trusted could be off by a fraction that mattered in winter dryness. Those were the counterweights that keep a clinician on ground rather than air. Still, I drafted a question in my notebook that did not let go. If a body can raise a room's dose line without harm to the body, what do our charts not capture about that body's history? Before leaving, I checked the day's badge upload. My personal dose nudge sat a little higher than a typical winter day. Nothing that broke policy, nothing that demanded a call to the regulator, but enough to make me watch the rolling average with a closer eye in the week to follow. I wrote the times, again next to the number so I would remember which hours to look back on. Then I added a line under the plan. Obtain whole body counter tomorrow morning. Repeat handheld survey with a battery-only meter in stairwell. Request air sample from waiting area. Ask patient to keep a simple log at home for that evening, noting any unusual smells or electronics misbehaving. I kept the language gentle. Patients deserve clarity, not alarm. At home that night, the taste returned once, faintly, while I warmed soup and stood by the stove, then faded. I held my badge in my hand as if its quiet could advise me. It did not. The physics I trusted had not broken. My interpretation had. The next day would refine the picture, either by closing the gap with a mundane source or by widening it. I slept with my notebook near the bed and woke before dawn to check I had not imagined the previous day. The plan, in my own handwriting, kept me anchored. In the morning, the patient was on the schedule again. I arrived early and ran my palm along the cool window frame of the control room, a habit, as if a room could tell me how it felt. The coin taste crept back when the patient stepped off the lift, a signal my body noticed before my mind did, and the pocket decimeter answered with a soft, uneven tick. I recorded the time, the line rise on the wall monitor, and the small sound that makes invisible things tangible. The investigation had begun, and with it, a set of open questions that would not resolve quickly. The first was practical: how to protect a person who did not feel unwell from a phenomenon that should have harmed him. The second was institutional: how to prove to a cautious hospital that the anomaly traveled with the patient and not with us. The third was mine alone: whether the boundary between picture and physics had shifted, or whether I had failed to see the ordinary cause hiding in the day's folds. I stood by the console and watched the screen wait for input. In my field, answers rarely arrive as revelations. They accrete as logs and timestamps, as the quiet ticks of monitors and the small tastes a person learns to trust. I flagged the case in our internal system so I could pull every related image and note into one thread. I reviewed the intake form again and noticed a single stray hair on the patient's sleeve, pale and short, clinging by static. I brushed it away with a gloved finger without thinking, and the handheld meter on the sill ticked faster for 2 heartbeats and then fell quiet. I wrote that down and underlined it. A small thing out of place, a small sound in response. It may have been nothing, or it may have been the first breadcrumb on a path I did not yet understand. The day settled into routine around the anomaly. Other scans, other ordinary findings, other small decisions that make up a life in images. Between cases, I returned to the memo and expanded the test plan. Repeat surveys in a different wing. Check the stairwell with battery-only equipment. Observe the patient at rest under a camera that timestamps every breath. Cross-reference badge data for anyone who entered the annex during the window. Each step had a clear purpose, a way to rule out pride and wishful thinking. Each step also promised to either close the circle or widen it. I closed the notebook on a final line that steadied me. Proceed as if the world is ordinary until the evidence insists it is not. By early light, the plan sat on my desk in careful lines. The physicist arrived with a second brand of handheld meter, fresh batteries sealed in a clear bag, and a notebook ruled with dark squares that he favors when uncertainty rises. We began in the shielded alcove used by nuclear medicine colleagues for whole-body counting. The room is lined to quiet the world outside. Its air feels thicker, like a library where sound has to ask permission. I noted the wall monitor at calm baseline. The coin taste stayed away until the patient stepped through the doorway. Then it crept back, faint at first, and the dosimeter at my collar answered with a soft, irregular tick. The shielded counter took a minute to settle. With no tracer administered, it should have stared into silence. Instead, a low, steady rise emerged that waxed and waned with the patient's breathing pattern. The physicist read off the trend in plain language, avoiding numbers in favor of directions. Baseline lifted, small crest on exhalation, fall on pause. He walked a slow arc around the counter with his hand held, and the meter hummed a little louder at chest height than at knee level. We had expected the room to kill any interference. The pattern should have vanished. It did not. I recorded the sequence carefully. Early morning entry, initial quiet, rise within a handful of breaths, decay to near baseline after the patient stepped out and waited in the corridor. The patient reported no warmth or taste. The technologist logged that the patient felt well and asked if more time would be needed. In the alcove book, the physicist summarized the trace as a faint, repeatable lift that favored the softer tissues and tracked with respiration. He left a blank line to fill with later analysis of which energy bands had carried the lift, though in that room we keep our vocabulary simple for cross-service notes. We stepped out to a concrete stairwell, away from wires and ducts, and repeated a handheld survey with battery-only meters. The metal taste rose in my mouth as the patient took the second step, a signal my body registered before the machines did. The pocket dosimeter on my collar answered with a scatter of quiet ticks that quickened when I stood at arm's length from the patient and slowed when I stepped to the side. The physicist wrote that the pattern remained in the absence of mains power or nearby consoles. We had peeled away a layer of possible causes and found the line still climbing. Clothing became the next suspect. We issued a laundered gown that had just returned from central processing, bagged and labeled. The patient changed behind a curtain, and we bagged the original clothes for later wipe testing. The gown made no difference. The room monitor in the annex lifted by the same small step as before when the patient entered. The handheld meter read a similar rise when held to chest height. The images from a brief low-dose series showed the same bright scatter that moved with soft tissue and faded toward the limbs. I wrote in the control log that removal of street clothes did not alter the room trend or the imaging artifact. We turned to air. A filter cartridge from the waiting area vacuum was exchanged, labeled with date and time, and sent to a counter that, by evening, would often show whatever dust had chosen to settle there. We also asked facilities to sample air in the annex and the main suite. The safety team favors samples that preserve context. They prefer quiet corners where dust has a chance to remember what rushed through the day. I added a line to request a simple swab of the consultation room carafe after the patient's visit. Not because water should carry this story, but because small containers sometimes surprise us. While those steps began their slow march, I opened the archive for patterns. We do not always look sideways across clinics, but when we do, the hospital reveals a coherence it hides in the rush. I searched for non-contrast studies from the prior seasons with similar starry patterns and no declared metal. A handful surfaced. The images were faint cousins, not siblings. One chest film from last autumn showed a mild halo that a colleague had annotated as probable noise. Another abdomen series from the previous spring had a scatter the technologist had blamed on a belt buckle forgotten until the second pass. The notes did not anchor to one room or one day of the week. If there was a lineage, it was weak. Still, I marked them into a private ledger that lives on a secured drive. A habit from years of chasing innocuous ghosts that sometimes arrange themselves into new instructions. Institutional pressure grew in parallel. The chief remained calm but began to ask for twice-daily updates. The regulator's reporting threshold hovered at the edge of our discussion, invoked by safety but deferred while we collected more than a single day's oddity. Staff asked practical questions about proximity, badges, and whether they should rotate away from the suite. The nurse manager reminded us of patient dignity when our curiosity leans toward spectacle. I kept my language exact and my posture ordinary. Our work begins to wobble when posture gets strange. Late morning brought an unexpected datum. The intake questionnaire from the previous day had a small checkbox at the end that asks about recent household changes. The patient had marked bereavement and written a single word beside it in a tight hand that the clerk had deciphered and summarized as loss of a pet. The date line was the prior week. The nurse confirmed that a remark about a brother's home had also been made in passing. something about a dog that had not woken. She kept the tone neutral in her note. I read those lines twice and kept my face still even though I felt the coin taste rise again, as if the body knew what the mind was considering. I added to the plan. Verify with primary care if any home health or veterinary contacts had occurred. Keep names outside the radiology record. Route through privacy channels. By early afternoon, the physicist had a brief spectral note. He described the lift as living in the lower energy range typical of soft scatter rather than the harder needle-like signature of metal. He emphasized caution. He wrote that the shape did not match any single therapeutic seed used in our region. He reminded us to consider non-ionizing interference that might throw our counters off, even though the stairwell survey had argued against it. He prefers to leave space in his sentences for later correction. I have learned to value that space. We took the unusual step of moving the patient to a mobile unit, parked on the far side of the staff lot. It runs off a separate generator and sits outside the building's ductwork. If the rooms had been the source, the effect should have faded there. The unit's monitor idled at background until the patient crossed the threshold. Then the line rose by the familiar small step. The handheld meter read the same breath-tied rise at chest height, a little stronger when the patient exhaled slowly. The images showed a cleaner field due to the machine's newer detectors, yet the starry scatter still traced the soft interior like a frost on glass. I wrote that the change of building and mains power did not alter the pattern. That sentence should have broken the story's spine. It did not. We added simple physiologic controls. The patient drank water and rested. The counts did not surge in a way that matched that act. The patient stood and sat. The rise tracked position only insofar as breathing changed. We asked the patient to breathe shallowly, then to hold breath briefly. The handheld trace followed obediently. When the patient laughed at a remark the technologist made, the lift spiked and then fell. The meter does not know laughter, but it does know the air that carries it. Each observation was recorded without color in the annex log. Lift on exhalation, lift on chest expansion, quiet on stillness. Mid-afternoon brought results from the bagged clothing. Wipes on the exterior of the shirt and trousers read near baseline. A wipe from the inside of the collar read a touch higher, but settled quickly when rechecked. The bag itself held no surprise. The swab from the consultation room carafe, however, ticked a little above background within the hour after the patient's visit. By morning, it would likely return to quiet. The physicist cautioned again. Portable counters tease and then hide. But he wrote the observation into the safety note because omission can mislead the next person who reads the file and wonders why we ignored what we saw. I returned to the stray hair I had brushed from the patient's sleeve the prior day. The memory had bothered me because it had felt like a thread tugged without intention. The cleaning staff had already emptied the control room bin, so the hair was gone. Still, the idea of small things carrying large stories took hold. I asked the nurse to place a sticky roller pass over the chair where the patient had waited that morning, just once, with care for dignity. The sheet was labeled and sent with the filter to the counter. It felt excessive. It also felt proper. Toward late day, the hospital's risk team convened, as it does when uncertain events begin to pencil themselves into procedure. The discussion filtered back to me through short summaries from safety and the chief. Isolation was raised as a possibility if the pattern persisted. The ethics team reminded us that isolation without harm is a high bar. Public health asked through channels whether any staff or visitors had reported symptoms. No one had. My badge showed a modest nudge above my usual winter day. The technologist's badge read similar. The physicist's badge sat at his calm baseline. The patient felt well. The patient asked, through the nurse, whether he could go home after the last series. The nurse wrote that he had family obligations that evening. I kept my report language steady and my own feelings out of it. Late afternoon, a message arrived through primary care confirming that the patient's household had reported a sudden loss of a cat within the prior week, without clear cause. Another note, rooted from a practice across the river, recorded that a dog at the brother's address had been brought in and could not be revived. The dates aligned loosely with our first day's encounter. There were no toxicology details we could use. The words sat in the file like stones. Correlation is seductive. It also misleads. Still, I felt the coin taste rise sharply when I read the addresses, and my dosimeter clicked twice in a quiet corridor where it had no business speaking. As the day closed, the physicist and I stood beside the mobile unit's door and reviewed the ledger we had built in a single, long shift. Multiple rooms, including a shielded space, showed a reproducible, patient-associated rise that tracked the breath. Battery-only surveys in concrete isolation reproduced the lift. Changing clothing did not change the pattern. Wipes were nearly quiet. Air and water samples near the patient showed a faint, time-limited echo. Images across platforms showed a soft tissue scatter that refused to yield to routine artifact controls. Household notes mentioned animals lost without cause in a time window that overlapped the visits. Staff felt well. The patient felt well. The numbers, kept in words to avoid the disguise of precision, hovered at a few times background at peaks, then fell when the patient left. Nothing in our training told us how to classify a person who appeared to carry a small zone of raised dose without harm to himself and with no metal to blame. We proposed one more attempt to falsify before night fell. We would wheel a battery-powered camera with a timestamp into an unused basement therapy room with thick masonry walls and no adjacent suites. We would place the patient at rest for a short interval with measured airflow and no staff in arm's reach. We would record the room monitor, a handheld meter placed on a chair, and a second meter across the room to serve as witness. If the lift persisted in that silence, we would have to concede that the phenomenon traveled with the patient through environments designed to cancel everything but a person's own biology. If the lift fell away, we could return to hidden sources and prideful errors. We set the plan for evening, after clinics closed, to minimize disruption. I ate a quick meal in the staff break room and tasted metal in the first bite, then laughed silently at myself when the taste vanished and returned only when I stepped into the corridor and met the patient's gurney being rolled toward the lift. The dosimeter ticked, soft and irregular. The lift doors closed with a hiss. The basement room waited with its cool, silent walls. The protocol that steadies a hospital was about to meet a case that did not fit its edges, and I felt the particular calm that comes when a belief is ready to be tested to the point of breaking. We rolled the gurney into the basement therapy room just after clinics went quiet. The walls were thick masonry, the ceiling low, the air slow and cool. Facilities had cut the mains feed to the adjacent suite for the hour. The physicist placed a battery meter on a wooden chair at arm's length from where the patient would sit, and a second meter across the room to act as witness. A small camera with its own battery stood on a tripod in the corner, its timestamp set against the clock in the corridor. The nurse recorded that the patient felt well and agreed to rest without speaking. I noted the wall monitor at calm baseline. In that quiet, the soft click of my dosimeter sounded larger than it was. We closed the door and set the deadbolt that does not latch unless fully turned. The nurse remained in the corridor with a clipboard and a watch. The physicist and I stood beneath the stairwell vent with our own handheld meters powered only by their cells. I wrote the sequence as we had planned it. Door sealed, room at rest, patient seated, camera running, no staff within reach. Through the glass, I watched the patient settle, shoulders loose, hands on knees. The chair meter ticked at background for a handful of breaths, and then lifted by the same small step we had come to know. The witness meter on the far table matched the trend, but flatter, as distance should dictate. The camera display showed steady frames, edges clean. The coin taste crept across my tongue as the patient exhaled, and the lift rose with that breath, then fell on the pause. The pattern repeated, slow tide against stone. At the midpoint of the interval we had set, the lift did not plateau as it had elsewhere. It climbed another shallow step and held. The chair meter hummed a little faster, still well short of any alarm. The witness meter echoed the shape with a lag. The camera display showed a faint snow that does not belong to that device. My dosimeter clicked in a rhythm that matched the patient's slow breathing, and then lost the rhythm. In the corridor log, the nurse wrote that the air felt colder against her hands for a few moments and then normal, a detail she almost crossed out but left after looking at the steady line on the wall monitor outside. I recorded the time in words because writing numbers lends false authority. In the last stretch of the interval, the climb sharpened without leaping. The patient remained still. The camera display flickered and then returned. The chair meter's hum thinned as if the battery had dipped, but a glance at its display showed full icon. The coin taste in my mouth sharpened and then vanished entirely, as if a door had opened somewhere I could not see. My dosimeter, which had been quietly busy, went silent for the length of a held breath. The physicist's meter at his waist did the same. Silence, where there should have been small sound, is, in our work, its own kind of noise. We unbolted the door at the end of the interval. The nurse logged the turn. The deadbolt moved without hesitation. Inside, the room lights recorded at their ordinary brightness. The chair sat empty. The patient's gown lay folded once, not tossed, on the seat, as if placed by a hand careful not to wrinkle. On the floor beside the chair lay the laundered socks we had issued in the annex, toes aligned with the chair legs. The camera had not toppled. The witness meter on the far table read near background and resumed its mild chatter when the door opened. The chair meter read a trace above background and fell as I watched. The clock on the camera display and the clock on the corridor wall disagreed by a breath's length. Neither device had moved. We searched the immediate spaces first. The therapy closet held only bands and mats. The maintenance hatch in the corner wall was shut and screwed. The ceiling tiles above the chair showed dust that could be read like snow on a branch. Nothing had brushed them. Down the corridor, the stairwell door had remained closed. The latch has a tendency to complain when moved, and it had not complained. The nurse's shoes would have recorded any chase in wet prints from the mop that had passed a short while before. No prints crossed the corridor line. Facilities reviewed the building access log for that hour and found no badge movement on that floor. The lift camera prior and after the interval showed an empty car. The camera in the therapy room had recorded without sound, but with a steady view of the chair and the patient's frame. In the last slice of the interval, the patient's outline softened rather than moved. The pixels did not smear as they do when a subject stands. They lost contrast as if a fog had settled within the rectangle of his body. The folded gown appeared between frames like a decision made off-screen and then shown. The timestamp, when aligned with the corridor clock, lost a handful of heartbeats at the critical moment, a gap that might be device drift or the small cruelty of luck. We copied the file onto 2 secure drives and sealed the original card in a tamper bag. We did the steps required by a hospital's duty. Security closed the nearby exits. Safety wrote that the event should be treated as a missing person with an associated technical anomaly. Ethics reminded us to keep language free of spectacle. Risk opened a sentinel report. I called the chief and spoke in the past tense because that is how one holds focus under pressure. In my log, I described the room, the chair, the folded fabric, the battery icons on the meters, the brief silence on my dosimeter, the taste that vanished. The physicist wrote a spare paragraph that many weeks later I could recite from memory. Witness meter recorded lift, chair meter recorded lift, brief synchronized quiet. Patient not present on door open, no evidence of egress. Days followed in which the hospital became a device for looking outward. Police took statements. Footage from the stairwell and the service ramp showed only the motion of staff doing ordinary things. No one reported a person leaving barefoot. The patient's home was checked. A note came back that the flat was neat, the bed made, the windows latched, a small pet water bowl on the kitchen mat dry. The brother's address held nothing that answered any of this. The veterinary practices repeated their earlier entries. We received no toxicology that could be reconciled with our readings, only sorrow compressed into single lines. I read those notes and placed them beside my logs without drawing a line between them. The day I tried to draw one, I stopped my pen and wrote instead that correlation is a net that catches truth and debris in the same weave. In the weeks that followed, we changed practice in small, durable ways. Portable counters that used to live in drawers moved into sight near doorways. Air filters from waiting areas were bagged and logged on a schedule. Intake forms added a prompt that asked about household losses of animals and electronics behaving oddly, phrased with care. The annex log grew a new column where technologists could record any room sensation that repeated without a clear cause, so that staff could share reality without embarrassment. I began to carry a battery meter in my coat pocket along with my badge. When I crossed certain corridors and felt the coin taste rise, I paused and recorded the place in words. Most days, the taste never came. On a few days, it arrived and left like a memory that did not belong to me. The physicist, who does not love speculation, agreed to test one more mapping. He overlaid our room lifts and my corridor notes with a map of the building's ground and the line of the tram that passes the hospital. An older engineer from facilities, the sort who knows where pipes run from decades back, pointed to the substation beyond the staff lot where the tram feeds take their breath. He said it had once shared a basement with a workshop that no longer exists, a place rumored to have kept luminous paints and odd lamps when such things were cheaper than care. We walked the footpath by that wall one evening and listened. My dosimeter did not speak. My mouth tasted like air. A cat crossed the path ahead and vanished into shrubs. We went home without writing anything down. That absence also belongs in the record. Counter-hypotheses multiplied in the face of an unsatisfying fact. A hidden egress in the therapy room we had missed. An accomplice with a badge and a careful step. A device interference we misunderstood that left a room looking like a stage. A person who chose to leave and found the one path where we did not look. An environmental coupling that our building, our tram, our winter air, and a single physiology conspired to make. A body that retained and breathed out something it had absorbed years before, thickening the air for a few breaths enough to move a meter's needle and to burden small animals over a night, while sparing the person who carried it because of some unrecorded adaptation. Each line explained part of the ledger, none closed it. If the phenomenon was true as we measured it, then our classification fails. We would need to name a living person as a source and design care pathways that protect others without branding a patient as hazard. We would need to move from rooms that defend against machines to spaces that admit uncertainty in biology. We would owe families a plain language for risks no one had agreed to carry. If it was artifact, then our hospital is capable of building illusions that survive across rooms, devices, and staff, which is its own kind of hazard because illusions teach policies as effectively as facts do. I tended my skepticism like a small fire and kept feeding it the scraps of counter-evidence we collected. It did not go out. It did not warm the room. Months later, late winter turned soft. I left the hospital one evening and walked along the tram rails toward the stop where the platform meets the old substation wall. Between the rails, small stones rattled under wheels that were not yet there. I carried the battery meter without turning it on because I wanted to know what my body would say first. A breeze came down the street and brought nothing to my tongue. Then, very faintly, the coin taste rose and settled as the wind shifted. I switched the meter on and held it, level with my chest. It ticked at background. I breathed out and laughed at myself, out loud in a way no one heard. On the far side of the wall, a dog barked once, and then nothing. I stood that way until the tram arrived and the moment was lost to the sound of brakes. In my office, the case file lives in a folder marked with the plainest words the system permits. The camera card remains sealed. The witness meter's hourly logs sit beside my handwritten notes, which are more detailed than I usually allow. The filter cartridges we labeled that week were all measured and found ordinary by morning, except the one from the consultation room that evening, which read a touch above background for a short while and then returned to quiet. The sticky roller sheet captured fibers that safety cataloged as lint and one cat hair, pale and short, that carried no reading by the time it was counted. These are small things. They are also the things I have when memory tries to pull meaning from air. Change has a way of disguising itself as routine. The annex suite is busier than it was. Staff rotate through on a schedule that began as caution and now reads like efficiency. I still pause when a pocket meter hums more than habit, and I still taste metal when the hallway light catches dust at a certain hour, a coincidence I cannot prove. I never wrote the word impossible in any note because the word pins a belief to a page, and I will not do that to my future self. The last line in my personal ledger for this case took me a spring to draft. It is not a flourish. It is a question that a hospital cannot carry for me. I wrote it in ordinary script so that I would have to read it out loud when I forget why the file remains open. The question is this: how do you label a living patient in a medical record when the safest, most accurate term for what you measured is source?